Hello, everyone. I'm so delighted. I'm kind of choked up. Hello. I'd like to tell you, as Louise said, a very personal story for me. My father was a different type of soldier. So I'm going to talk to you about the Tin Hats concert party. They were performing from 1941 till 1945. So for normal people like me, when we think of soldiers, we think of combat soldiers. And when you look at the American movies, mostly they're all, charging up a hill with a gun. And that wasn't the case for all of the Canadian soldiers. So the war effort was much more than just the infantry and the artillery. These are four members of the Tin Hats concert party. There was Charles Moore. He was from Toronto. He was actually in an infantry regiment. He was with the Toronto Regiment. Bliss MacDonald. He was from New Brunswick, and he was with, now I have to remember this, RCEME, which is the Royal Corps of Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. I had to tell myself this about 20 times last night to try and remember what it was. Bill Dunstan was my father. He was from Saskatchewan, Regina specifically, and he was with the 10th Field Ambulance. Johnny Hewitt was from Toronto, and he was with the Canadian Dental Corps. So as you can see, the members of the Tin Hats, usually around 20 soldiers, they were from across Canada, and they were also from different regiments. So the Canadian military, they knew they had a problem. All of these Canadian soldiers had come over from Canada to England, just raring to fight and to contribute to the war effort. And they felt that all they did was sit around and march. So they were bored, frustrated, and starting to do things that generally young men with nothing to do will do. They yearned also for a taste of home. These were young men that were probably away from home for the first time, for the majority. They didn't like the British shows. They found them vulgar and frankly condescending for a Canadian audience. They missed their wives, their girlfriends, their mothers, their sisters. But they also wanted that Hollywood glamour and girls. It was all about girls. And they wanted, I heard a snort. They wanted to forget the war and be young and carefree again. So what was the answer? Canadian concert parties that could follow the troops wherever they might be, even up to the front lines. The reason for this was that paying celebrities was expensive, and they weren't used to warlike conditions. They wanted entertainers that would understand the soldiers and could travel with them. The Tin Hats formed in September of 1941, and they were such a success that there were an additional 4 concert parties that were put into place. These 4 were the kit bags, the forage caps, the haversacks, and the bandoliers. So if you notice, they're all sort of military terms. I'm just going to go back. So here, this is the full cast in August of 1941. This particular picture was taken in London in December of 1941, and they actually performed for Vincent Massey, who became one of Canada's Governor Generals. What you can see also is that there are 2 female impersonators in the group. My father was one of them. He's the one here on the right, looking a lot like Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. So they were soldiers first. They all had basic training. Bert Witherall, who played trumpet, was with the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery before the war. Joe Rennie, who was their stage manager, was with the 77th Battery in Moose Jaw. Charles Moore had been in the interwar militia. Charles Moore and Frank Miskelly actually served in Iceland, which was the first Canadian assignment overseas. The shows were written and performed by Canadian soldiers representing different parts of the country and coming from different regiments and units. So this was done on purpose to show the soldiers that they were really one of them. They understood them. So the concert party program was a show that offered a fast-paced and uncomplicated variety format. Most of the soldiers were familiar with vaudeville. This was a standard vaudeville variety type of show. And there was something for everyone in it. So there was a swing orchestra, which was really big in the early 1940s. There were classical soloists. There were comedians with Canadian jokes, Canadian content, soldier jokes, soldier content. There were song and dance men. There was a cowboy act, because of course you came from Canada, you had to have cowboys. There was a variety act. This was a man named Albert Peewee Boudoin. He was 4'11". How he was ever enlisted in the army, I couldn't say. But he was a contortionist and a fire eater. And then, of course, there were the female impersonators. Norman Harper, you can see he has the standard cowboy hat, the leather chaps, the bandana, and the guitar. He had the ladies just swooning. They would be sending him fan mail. John Cooper is at the end of the table here on the top right. He was actually performing in blackface, which horrible from our standards, but at the standards of the time, they didn't think so. He was actually singing and channeling Al Jolson, who sung in the 1920s, usually in blackface. In the middle is my father, Bill Dunstan, making at the makeup table. And in the front is Ronnie White. He was an incredible, versatile performer. He could act, he could sing, and he was a heck of a stage manager. He was from New Brunswick, specifically from Grand Falls. I'm not sure, but it's very likely he was with the Carleton and York Regiment, because that's where they were based. Down on the bottom is Frank Ludwig. As you can hear from his name, he was a French-Canadian from Montreal, and he was the straight man to Wally Brennan's comic act. He came from the 6th Recce Regiment, and they were actually, they became a motorcycle unit that was involved in all of the dispatches. Wally Brennan, he was their star comic. He was actually a professional vaudeville actor. He'd been touring the States since the age of 13, so he was able to sing, dance, act as a comic, and also he could write his own sketches, and he wrote most of the Tin Hat sketches. Well, someone had to wear a dress. So this isn't something that I made up. This was actually something that was written by a man named Eldridge. He was talking about female impersonators in the Burma War. And it really fit here. First of all, cross-dressing was an accepted form of entertainment among Commonwealth soldiers. In addition, women at the time did not go to the front lines. It was just something that would have been unheard of. And donning women's clothes for comedic effect was something that you did in the barracks, just for goofing around. It often involved smearing lipstick on their lips and putting grapefruits or oranges down their tops. The female impersonators were a little different. They really studied the feminine form and attributes, and they strived for authenticity. The soldiers were starved for feminine beauty and grace, and this is what the Trilby and Trixies of the world provided for them. They became an integral part of the concert party shows. As I was telling people that I wanted to tell this story, I had people just kind of lower their voice a little bit and look at me and said, "Do you really want to tell this story? Did anyone sort of say things about your dad and his identity in any way?" No. So the female impersonators, for the most part, they were just taking one for the team. That dressing as women, it was not an identity, it was not a kink in any way. So it was their unique way to contribute to the war era, effort, and they were actually much appreciated. They did get a little bit of heckling sometimes. Around payday, the soldiers were maybe a little ripe, and they might say some things, but on the whole, they were very well respected. The garrison shows were very simple and simply advertised. And as you can see here on the right, it was just a simple penciled-in placard on the outside of the Garrison Theatre. I'd like to stop here because this would be a perfect time to show the newsreel. Thank you.
Hurry, 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 folks. It's showtime in the old Garrison Theatre tonight. The house is jammed. Standing room only is the order of the day because Johnny Canuck gets a kick out of shows put on by fellow Canadians. Isn't he a honey boy?
So that gives you an idea that it was very much like, it wasn't fancy, it was kind of like community theater. They used what they had available, and most of what they had was just the costumes that you saw. It was nothing elaborate. Over time, their shows evolved. To begin with, they were very simple. So you can see Joe Rocks here on the right. He was from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment from Edmonton. And he was actually a classically trained tenor. They talked about his golden voice. And he's singing beside Bill Dunstan, my father. And it looks like he's wearing a nursing sister's uniform. And you can see it's really very plain, very simple. Their acts evolved. If you look at the picture down on the bottom, this is also of my father, Bill Dunstan, in his total Trixie experience. And it's much more sophisticated. And he's also learned a little bit more about his craft of how to be a female impersonator. You can just see him just sort of simpering away, you know. Each tour, the producers developed a new program. They needed to make sure that it was fresh and exciting for the different soldier groups. Because if it wasn't up to snuff, they'd either start reading their reading material and magazines, or they'd just get up and go. So they had to make sure it was good. and exciting, fresh, and something they hadn't seen before. They toured England, Scotland, North Africa, Italy, Canada, and Northwest Europe. The programs evolved, as I said, to continue to delight their various audiences, and they became so popular that they were in newspapers across Canada, and also the other Allied soldiers started to say, hey, we want one of those shows in our units. So they played for the Americans, for the British, the New Zealanders. In Northwest Europe, they also did shows for the Polish and the Dutch soldiers. So entertaining on the front lines was a completely different experience. They had been in town halls, in small church halls, in big theaters, small theaters, medium-sized theaters, but on the front lines, they were more likely to be in Canadian Legion War Services tents, some of which were really quite big, or on the open-air shows, which were subject to rain or heat, sunlight. And they were also very small stages. So if you think about it, look at the entertainers standing on the stage. They were, as they say, cheek by jowl. They were quite small, and they had to limit their movements. If you can see right in the background, that was their orchestra behind them, so they didn't have a lot of wiggle room. The Tin Hats brought an old Hollywood style to the bleak existence of the soldiers in the front lines, and they often billeted with them. They traveled with them, and sometimes they had to change the timing or the actual day of the shows because the troops were on maneuvers. They were moving at the time. They understood their audiences and what they were going through as they lived among them and saw the devastation. In fact, my father told a story that he was dancing in a grass skirt across the stage as the ack-ack guns were going from the roof. And he said, my timing was hopelessly mixed up. I can imagine. When nothing else was available, they performed in tents and open-air venues. But oftentimes they performed in some of the old Italian theaters, which had been really severely bombed, but they made do. The electricians and the stage manager were very creative problem solvers because they never knew what they were going to find, how the electricity was going to be working, what they needed to actually illuminate the stage. And in fact, in one instance in Italy, they used the lights from a Bren carrier to light the stage, which is kind of cool. They weren't immune to fear and discomfort. On a train trip to one of their tours in Scotland, it took 17 hours to go from Birmingham to Blair Atoll with toilets that weren't functioning. It was in pitch black because there were blackout conditions even for the trains, and the guns on the top of the train were actually firing. They were stranded in North Africa because there were no ships for Italy at the time. And as soon as they got to the reception area, they were wallowing in mud and they were hit hard with dysentery. A number of the soldiers were admitted into hospital. They were billeted in bombed out houses where they feared the audible whine of the buzz bombs. My father told the story that he had some trouble getting to sleep because they had to bed down in this severely bombed out house. They could hear the buzz bombs, and someone said to him, if you can still hear them, you're okay. They performed on stage to the ack-ack of the guns on the roof of some of the theaters, And they drove through the Mad Mile in Lanciano under sniper fire. So this was, it's called the Mad Mile because there were hills on either side of the road, and the German snipers were firing down on the road. In Lanciano, this is the first time that they started to perform for the members of the Indian Army, which was kind of cool. In Italy, they brought on some new talent. There was Harold van Buskirk. He was originally from Edmonton and a well-known entertainer in his teens, and then he moved with his parents to Salt Spring, Vancouver. He was a member of the Canadian Medical Corps, which is a little different. And Jack Phillips was a third female impersonator by the name of Yvonne. He was from Calgary and a member of the Princess Pat's regiment. He was a Batman, and no, he wasn't. He didn't fly through the air. He was a form of a valet, or I think it was a captain. This particular show was held near Ortona in a Canadian Legion War Services tent. And you can see in the back is Glenn Morley. He was the orchestra director. And you can see how he's crammed into this tiny space. This would be a great time to show the new directions.
Early 44 on the Italian front. The winter line is cold and quiet. Canadian concert parties break the gloom.
There's roses that powdered their noses. There's roses that hinted their hair. Each is a lovely rose, but here is a rose that I know. She's a hard-boiled rose. She says D's, dem and a doze. She can yes you to death while you're spending your dough. But boys, if you're broke, can't that dame say no? She's a hard-boiled rose.
Now, guys, that side-splitting scatterbrain, our star and producer, Wally P. Brennan.
I still don't get it.
Wally.
Yeah.
I'll explain it so that even you will understand it.
Thanks very much.
Now, you take this flower.
Take the flower.
And you waft it gently under a young lady's nose.
Yeah?
She falls madly in love with you.
You mean to say one waft and you got her?
That's the idea.
Will it work for me?
Why, certainly it will.
Give me that thing, boy. I'll grab the next one. Oh, get it. Hey, Slack, just a moment, please. Wafty, wafty. Yippee!
Hearts are high when the band goes by, and we're marching on parade. With our flags unfurled, we will show the world that our colors came on parade.
You may have noticed or wondered why some of those soldiers seemed kind of blank-faced. They were exhausted. This was, that particular show was shot just outside of Ortona, which was the site of some of the worst fighting for Canadian soldiers. And often they walked from the front lines to the show. So they were exhausted, and the few that were able to smile would show you that they were really enjoying it. Okay. Tragedy struck. The Tin Hats were on their way to Normandy shortly after D-Day when a torpedo hit their ship. Charles Moore, who was their trumpeter, Joe Rennie, their stage manager, and Bliss MacDonald, their driver, were picked up somewhere near Dungeness, and they were buried at the Folkestone Cemetery in Kent, not far from Dover. Bert Witherall, another trumpet player, was buried in Bayeux Cemetery in France. Somehow their lifeboat got turned around and they ended up in France. That's why he was buried there. Harold van Buskirk, such a difficult name for me. Harold van Buskirk spent months in hospital. He'd actually been thrown down the hatch in the explosion and had a percussion injury to his lungs. So he spent months in jail, and it actually turned into pneumopleurisy. Frank Miskelly, their pianist, had smashed his foot. I forgot to put it on, but Norm Harper had broken his arm, and Albert Pee Wee Baudoin sustained minor injuries. These four joined the Tin Hats, or the revamped Tin Hats, for a tour of Canada, and each one of these four wore a black wounded stripe. So these were experienced entertainers. Wally Brennan, as I mentioned, was a vaudeville actor from the age of 13, and he had been touring the US for many years. Les Abrams of Peterborough, he was actually with the, I keep saying the Hasty Peas, but it was the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment from Northern Ontario. He had actually performed with and been a stage manager for the Dumbbells. They were a concert party from the First World War that actually toured Canada in the interwar years. He was an experienced drummer, and he did do a short stint with the Tin Hats, but he joined the Forage Caps as their orchestra director and toured with them often either before or behind the tours of the Tin Hats. Charles Moore, as I said, played trumpet, and he had done gigs all over Southern Ontario and Quebec before the war. Frank Miskelly of Smith Falls played piano in the Ottawa Valley, often for churches. Bill Smith, also of Ottawa, both Frank Miskelly and Bill Smith were with the Camerons of Ottawa. And he performed trumpet across the northern US, and he also performed for the Kitbacks as well. Bert Witherall of Kingston spent 16 years in a Canadian Army band. It was a traveling show, and this is a bit what their days looked like. They traveled almost every day. There were rehearsals in the morning. They would pack up and load the stage equipment in 2 3-ton trucks, standard Canadian Army trucks. There's a picture of my father with pipes, and I never saw pipes on him as I was growing up. So he was obviously lifting big crates for all of their equipment. They traveled by truck or train. Unpacking and setting up the stage, they could actually do that within 2 hours of arriving and be available to start their show. They did up to 2 shows a day. Sometimes after the show, there would be either a dance or an impromptu show. They'd pack up and return to their billets, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, so they were tired. No one was forgotten. The Tin Hats did shows at hospitals, rest areas, casualty bays, for the boys on stretchers, at convalescent homes. They did tours of the forestry camps in Scotland. Now that's really a very interesting story. The nobility in Scotland all had estates, and they agreed to bring loggers in to remove the wood for the war effort. So the wood was used for building planes, packing crates, anything you can think of that was required for the war effort. Now, as you can imagine, there weren't many foresters or lumberjacks in Scotland and England, so they imported them from Canada. They imported 30 companies of about 200 men from forestry camps all across Canada. And they set up in these out-of-the-way country estates to log. And the Tin Hats went on 2 different tours of Scotland, right up into the Highlands to some of these very remote camps. And they, as you can imagine, that there wasn't much entertainment, so they were very much appreciated. Excuse me, I'm just going to wet my whistle. So the Tin Hats also made stops at anti-aircraft batteries. They were entertaining some of the anti-aircraft batteries during some of the very important, I was going to say battles, where the anti-aircraft teams were on 24/7 alert. So they couldn't leave where they were, so they very much needed entertainment. These were places with very heavy security. One of them was in the Thames estuary at Essex. They were the first level of defense against bombings of London. They went directly to workshops, for working on cars and trucks. They went to petrol parks. I guess this is where they stored petrol for all of their trucks. Supply columns. They performed for the military police and also for RAF hangars for the RAF. One of them, which I just discovered this last week, was particularly disturbing for me. It was called the Non-Efficient Transit Depot. I thought it was maybe like a junkyard, where they could get spare parts. No, it was for non-effective soldiers who just couldn't make it in military life. And so they put them all in this depot to figure out what to do with them, to how to send them back to Canada and repatriate them. So just think of that, the non-effective transit depot. You put things in a depot. So I couldn't imagine why they would come up with such an unfortunate name. But they got 2 shows, so no one was forgotten. The Tin Hats played in small venues for anywhere between, I put 150 here, but there were some instances there were maybe only 50 to 80 guys that showed up. They still performed. They performed in medium-sized venues for 300 to 500 personnel, and open-air concerts for anywhere between 1,000 and 8,000 people. They actually did a show in Naples for the U.S. Army with an audience of 8,000 people. As you can see, there were the different types of units that they performed for. This first one is the triage for casualties. The second, this is actually a field hospital. And the third is for the Canadian Forestry Corps. So there were a mix of identities in the Tin Hats. They were gay, straight, and bisexual at a time when being gay was actually a court-martial offense with profound consequences. These profound consequences were that if they were brought to military court, they would lose their repatriation allowance, but they also were not ever allowed to work in the public service. And that was a very broad definition of the public service. So it was quite interesting that the secrets of some of these entertainers were kept. People knew, but they kept these secrets because they knew that there were really quite terrible consequences. My father mentioned that many relationships never saw the light of day. There was an understanding between the entertainers and their audiences, and a close, almost tender relationship among the troupe members. Johnny Hewood, who was out and proud, introduced Bill Gunston, my father, as his dear straight friend, and warned other people away from him, saying, don't leave this guy alone. But more importantly, the members of the troupe would look after each other without a second thought. So here on the right, you can actually see Norm Harper doing up my dad's dress. No problem, no issue. It's just what you needed to do to put the show on. The Tin Hats were also members of a wider community. Bert Churchill, who is here on the right, had been a radio pioneer in Western Canada before the war. He did a short stint with the Tin Hats. So he was with them until, I believe it was March of 1942, because he was needed. He was a sergeant, so they pulled him back to his unit. But he somehow, by 1945 in Europe, made his way back to the entertainment scene as a supervisor for the Canadian Legion War Services in Europe. So the Canadian Legion, the YMCA, the Knights of Columbus, there's a fourth that I can't remember off the top of my head, they were actually the organizers for the concert party circuit. They helped to schedule the times. They greeted the Tin Hats when they arrived on site. They were generally the managers, roadies for the concert parties. Jerry Wilmot of Vancouver was a broadcaster and a radio show host in Canada and overseas, and he often hosted the Tin Hats. He had a afternoon CBC radio program which was broadcast in Canada and to all soldiers certainly in Europe and then later overseas. And he often showcased Canadian talent. That was something he said was really too bad. There wasn't enough of that. Bert Turvey was with the Tin Hats. He was also from Vancouver, and after his stint with the Tin Hats, he joined the BBC as a war correspondent and then returned to the Tin Hats in Europe. Eugene Condé was a correspondent for the North Bay Nugget, and he actually traveled around Italy with the Tin Hats, reporting on each of their concerts. The Tin Hats were also representative of the experiences of the Canadian soldiers. Charles Moore, Joe Rennie, and Bert Witherall served in the Army before the war. I think I mentioned that. Charles Moore, Bert Witherall, and Wally Brennan had all had fathers who served in the First World War. Charles Moore and Frank Miskelly served in Iceland, the first Canadian overseas mission, and Les Abrams, Joe Rocks, Bert Churchill, and Harry Elsdon joined the first Canadian mission in France. This was actually around the time that Paris fell to the Nazis. They'd been shipped over to Normandy, and then they realized, ooh, the Nazis have taken Paris, so they hightailed it back to England. There was nothing more that they could do. And I forgot to put it in, but there was also another very interesting story. Johnny Hewood, his father actually was young enough to sign up for the Canadian Army, and he joined shortly after Johnny Hewood. So there were two generations who were part of the Canadian military. Jack Phillips, Joe Rocks, and Philip Pratt married English girls. Johnny Heawood was out and proud, as I mentioned, during a time when homosexuality was a court-martial offense. Frank Bolduc and Albert Pee-wee Baudoin were bilingual French-Canadians. If you remember the clip that we showed, the straight man, that was Frank Bolduc. You could not hear any type of an accent. Bill Coinca was a conscript. Most of the other Tin Hats had been volunteers. He was actually a conscript, and he joined the Tin Hats in January of 1945. It was actually when the Tin Hats went to perform at the North Bay Training Center, and they said, "Hey, you're really good, why don't you join us?" So he volunteered, and he went with them to Europe to entertain the occupying force there. Okay, so this is my research and why I did this. Like most of the soldiers, my father never talked about the war with us. It was something that an experience they'd had that they just tucked away and they put somewhere else. Or they talked with other soldiers or their former units about their experiences. For me, it was a very odd personal experience that just caught my imagination. How many other people could say, "Oh, my father spent the war in drag, and he had a drag mother." It's not the usual kind of story. And what happened was a researcher called my house saying he was researching gays in the military and wanted to talk to my father. And my father wasn't there at the time, and I just didn't know what to say. I just kind of croaked out, "Yeah, can I have your name and number and he'll call you back?" And just obviously my head was in a bit of a whirl. Years later, my son entered a history competition, and my father suggested that he cover the Tin Hats. Of course, I was helping because he was grade 7 at the time, I believe, and I was hooked. In addition, my father, accompanied by my mother, was interviewed for the National Film Board documentary Open Secrets, which talked about gay soldiers during the Second World War. And he talked about the difficulties of being a female impersonator during the war, and he said it was murder getting silk stockings. And if he wanted a bra, can you imagine saying to a quartermaster, "I need a bra"? A little bit suspect, you know? So during the pandemic, I had some time on my hands, so I started to look further for the needle in the haystack. How am I doing for time?
You're good. You've got another 10 minutes before we need to be in Q&A.
Oh, perfect, okay. So anyone who does historical research has to be a little creative and say, where else can I look? What do I need? How can I tell a coherent story? And how can I start to understand and even live through their experiences? So I started looking at the war diaries of the Tin Hats. Every day they had to say what they were doing, where they were, how many audience members they were playing to, anything that they thought might be important of a historical value. The interesting part of this is that if it was the Canadian Army overseas, those records are in Kew, in the National Archives in London. Anything that was happening in Canada is more likely to be at the National Library and Archives Canada, but it's a bit hit and miss as to what is available. There were newspaper articles from Canadian and British newspapers to begin with, because they were such a sensation and such a different type of group. They were covered extensively by the Canadian press. as you can see, there was the Canada at War series and the Canadian Army newsreels. In the Canadian Army newsreels, what they did was they showed these newsreels before every movie that the soldiers watched, and they really worked hard at making sure that everyone was covered. So every unit had a bit of a voice, and that included also what the Tin Hats were doing. There were a couple of books, one of the boys by Paul Jackson. My father was interviewed for this book. Also research by Laurel Halliday for her thesis on Canadian concert parties. And before I started to write the book, I was wondering, am I going to step on anybody's toes if I do this? So I asked her if it was okay, and she said, I would be delighted. Your father was a lovely man. So I thought, all right, I'll do this. There was The $500,000 and Juno by Ted Barris. He's also a Canadian author. He actually interviewed Eugene Moore, who was the son of, I'm blanking, the trumpeter, Charles Moore. There was also Letters from Beaulieu by Melinda Jarrett. She talked about the experiences of the Canadian Forestry Corps. Then, of course, there was The Regiment by Farley Mowat. And for anyone who's read Farley Mowat's works, he was hilarious. And he described in detail the flight from Normandy just in front of the Nazis before they took over in Paris. He also gave a very good indication of what it was like to be in the militia in the interwar years. And of course, there were extensive reports for the operations in Iceland. When I was writing the book, it was very clear to me that I needed many voices, not just mine and my father's, to fill in some of the gaps. And this is where other children of the Tin Hats and their extended families started to reach out to me to contribute their stories. I also put myself in their shoes to be able to build a storyline. With Paul Donnellan, he was the son of Bliss MacDonald, I followed the route taken during the Harlequin exercise in Hampshire. This was a massive exercise, including the entire Canadian Army. And what they were doing was they were testing their ability to have large masses of soldiers go from a mustering point to an embarkation point to get ready for an invasion of Normandy. So the Tin Hats followed these soldiers throughout the route, and it was actually very secret. Everyone was told that they had to clean up after themselves. They weren't allowed to talk to anyone. So it was a big deal. And I realized that they walked this whole place. They walked this whole route. I did it in a car. So it was quite an interesting feeling. I also visited with Paul Donnellan at the Folkestone Cemetery and found each one of the gravestones, and it was quite a humbling experience, actually. I visited with Eugene Moore. He's the son of Charles Moore. I should have looked at my slides to remember his name. And he shared his father's letters home and a picture of himself also in Folkestone, looking at his father's gravestone. What was interesting was that the letters home gave a really good indication of how the soldiers were feeling as they were far from home. And one of the huge preoccupations were cigarettes. There were just never enough of them. So the letters home, many of them were, can you send some more cigarettes? And can anyone else from the family send more cigarettes? They were issued on each tour 1,000 cigarettes. Now, I assume that that just wasn't enough. Just recently, in November, December, I toured the Scottish Highlands to have a sense of what it was like in the Canadian forestry camps. I deliberately went in late November, early December, because from what I understand, that the last time that the Tin Hats were there, they were there in the fall, and it was cold, it was miserable, and they all had colds, but they still traveled every day and performed, even if their voices were failing. I also attended a variety of community-based theater productions to just, again, to have an idea of what it was like to perform with minimal stage productions and in such a confined space. And this is my last slide. I'll be ready for a Q&A. Why now? It's about keeping the Tin Hats story alive. Even the children of the Tin Hats are either elderly or have already passed on. I believe I'm the baby of all of them. The traveling show was a way of life that may never again be repeated. With the advent of the internet, there may never be such a concentration of soldier audiences again. And it's time to honor a type of service that has been largely forgotten. Shameless plug. So my first book was a different type of bombshell. This was more about me finding out more about my father and his experiences and how I felt about them. Then what happened, as I mentioned, the extended families of the Tin Hats members started to reach out to me and share their stories with me. And I started to realize that it wasn't just my father's story. There were many other people with equally interesting stories, and I was hooked. So I wrote the second one, Ballads, Bombshells and Brotherhood. And of course, once a writer, always a writer. You're always pushing yourself. And you also find with historical research that what you understand today may not be the truth, because you'll find another document that tells a slightly different story or gives a slightly nuance, or you were just dead wrong right from the beginning. So I started to write a different type of soldier, which was about the other Canadian military concert parties, or the other all-male military concert parties. And their stories are equally interesting. Now, even with this final book, I'm still finding out stuff that I hadn't understood properly. I did mention today that I found out about the non-effective transit depot and realized it wasn't machinery, it was people. And there are all these funny little details that just keep coming up. So I shall have the last book published, I'm hoping for in the spring. But I can tell you that if I still have the bug and want to write a fourth, I'll find things that I've managed to mess up or misunderstood even from the first book. So that's really all I have to say for today. Thank you for your time and your interest.
So before I do a thank you, we'll open it up for questions, just to make sure that...
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Barbara, first up.
That was really, really interesting. And sort of the gay soldier part and the female impersonator, but I want to know, how did you become a Tin Hat?
Yes, that's a good
How does one become a Tin Hat?
Yeah, good question.
So many of the entertainers, because they were entertainers, that was their life, that's what they did. So the soldiers were actually encouraged to entertain themselves in their barracks, in their garrisons, but it was a small scale. And some of them Like my father, he was railroaded into putting on a dress, actually. And he did such a good job that he did it again. He did it in Regina, he did it again in Moose Jaw, I believe, and in Shiloh, Manitoba.
Informally. Right?
Informally, yes. And so when he got to England, there was actually a note that was sent around to all of the units saying, is there anyone who has any talents that they would wish to share? So this was an internal memo that went around, but also later on, as there were more concert parties and more needs for entertainment, because we actually had, I've heard 500,000, I've heard 1 million Canadians went overseas or were part of the military at the time. So there was a huge need for entertainment. And there was also a cycling in and out. So they actually put in, at the end of some of the Canadian newsreels, an advertisement saying, if you've got any talents, come forward. Yeah, so that's how it happened. Some of them were offshoots of the garrison's military band, and some of them started up in an impromptu way their own swing bands, because that's what all the soldiers wanted, and they wanted to dance and bring their girlfriends, and that's how they got started. So there was something that started in Canada, and then they just carried on doing what they did in England. Before the concert parties started, as I mentioned, there was the, I'm just so dry, I'm so sorry. Before the concert party started, there were different members of these impromptu bands that were invited to do things on the BBC program that was broadcasted to Canada and across the units. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it was sort of informal and then kind of became a little more formal, I guess.
Yes, yeah, they felt that the Canadian Army felt that they needed to address morale in a real way. Yeah, and in fact, when the tin hats were shipped over to Italy, they got stuck in North Africa, so it didn't happen. But when they were shipped over, General MacNaughton actually said they would be a Christmas present to the troops for in Italy. So yeah. Any other burning questions, or kind of covered it all?
Well, you certainly have an opportunity to have a one-on-one with her when we're finished. It's my